Hey Indian Creek 8th grade students, it's Professor Blazek and I'm here today with part 2 of our 6-part series on the American Civil War, looking at the road to the Civil War. Now the guiding question that I would like for you to keep in mind as you watch this video is, which events led to the eventual split between free and slave states in America, starting the Civil War? One of these events that would cause a rift between free and slave states was the Dred Scott Decision. The Dred Scott Decision took place on March 6, 1857, when the Supreme Court ruled on the case of Dred Scott. Now, Dred Scott was a slave whose master had moved him all around the country, including living in several free states. And so when Dred Scott's master died, Scott sued for his freedom. He said that because he had lived on free soil before, and now that his master had passed away, he was now a free man. Now the case took several years to actually get all the way up to the Supreme Court, occurring at a time where tensions were exceptionally high between free and slave states. Now this meant that many Americans hoped that the ruling on Dred Scott's case would be the final word, the final resolution on slavery. And what happened was Chief Justice Roger B. Taney ruled that Dred Scott was still a slave. And because Dred Scott was still a slave, he did not have the right to sue for his freedom. And this was obviously a fairly big blow struck in support of slavery, obviously something that would have been welcomed in the South and something that would cause outrage in the North. But as we're going to see, Chief Justice Taney did not stop here. Now, if you look in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a picture of Dred Scott on the right and a picture of Chief Justice Roger B. Taney on the left. Now, Taney would add to his ruling and said that slaves are not human beings but property, and the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution prohibits taking away property. So in essence, Taney is saying that the government has no right to remove slaves from the people who have owned them. And then Taney would finish by saying that Congress also had no right to prohibit slavery in any territory, including the states where slavery was currently banned. Essentially, Taney is saying that because the Fifth Amendment protects property and he deemed that slaves were property, and because he also said that Congress did not have the right to prohibit slavery anywhere, Taney was saying that the U.S. Constitution actually protected slavery. And you can imagine the outrage that this created amongst Northerners, and it did. And the Dred Scott Decision would be a huge divide between slave and free states. Now, obviously, the South, for the majority of the time, was thrilled by the decision to protect slavery, while the North was understandably outraged. And there were those in the North who called it the greatest crime ever committed by the U.S. court system. And I think in retrospect today, that seems like a pretty appropriate way to describe the decision. Now, in the wake of the Dred Scott Decision, tension continued to mount. There continued to be fighting between anti-slavery forces and pro-slavery forces. And this just led to more and more acts of violence. So one example of an act of violence that took place in this time came in October of 1857 when abolitionists raided a weapons and ammunition storehouse in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. And the leader of the raiders was named John Brown, and he was captured in the raid and sentenced to death. But his death would actually become a rallying point for abolitionists overall. So some said that he died as a martyr, which means that he died in the name of a good cause. And what happened was that the more attacks like these that kept happening, this caused Southerners to fear that the North was conspiring against them. So the Southerners thought that the North was out to get them, that the violence would not stop, and that there was simply no way that they were going to ever come to any sort of compromise or agreement with the other half of the country. Now, we have our first key term of the video, our fourth overall of this chapter that was referred to in the previous slide, and that term is abolitionist. And an abolitionist is a person who favors abolishing or ending slavery. Now, all of this violence and all of these events would lead up to the election of 1860, and slavery was obviously a huge issue in this election. The Republican Party, who was really the only party to take an anti-slavery stance, nominated Abraham Lincoln, and they believed that slavery should be left alone in areas it already existed, but should not be allowed in any new territories. And again, they were really the only party that took any sort of anti-slavery or limiting slavery stance. And Lincoln would go on to win the election by sweeping through the North. Every northern state he won, every anti-slavery state he won. And his name didn't even appear on most southern states' ballots. So this just goes to show how deep the divide was between the North and South when the candidate of a major party who happens to take the sort of stance on slavery that Lincoln did would not even be on the ballot in southern states. People weren't even allowed to have the option of voting for him, because that's how much of a threat Lincoln and the Republican Party were seen by the South to their well-being. Now, after he was elected, new President Lincoln and the Republican Party promised that they would leave slavery in current slave states. Remember that the original stance of the party and of Lincoln was that slavery would be allowed to continue in areas that it already existed. It just would not be allowed to spread. Now, even though this was the message that was put forth, the South did not trust Lincoln and the Republican Party at all. And what would happen is that on December 20th, 1860, so about a month or so after Lincoln was elected, South Carolina voted to secede from the Union. Remember, secede means to leave. And they would be the first southern state to break away from the rest of the United States. Now, after South Carolina left, there were many attempts to compromise and save the Union made by politicians in Washington, made by President Lincoln. But by February of 1861, so just about 2 to 3 months later, there were 6 more states that had joined South Carolina to form the Confederate States of America, a separate country. These 6 states were Texas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. So the whole rise in sectionalism that we talked about earlier in the first video is now really coming to its most extreme consequences, where we have 7 states that have broken away and are looking to form their own separate country. Now, the next key term we have in this video is states' rights. And states' rights was Southerners' explanation for why they left the United States, why they wanted to break away. The South claimed that the national government had violated their rights and that they were free to choose to leave the Union. They said that originally they made the choice to join the Union way back when, during the Revolutionary War, and they also then therefore had the right to leave the Union when their rights had been violated. Now, there were different reactions to secession across the country. In the South, most Southerners were happy about secession, while there were a few who felt that it would lead to disaster. They didn't think that they would be allowed to simply just break off and form a separate country. In the North, there were a handful of Northerners who preferred secession over continuing to allow slavery because they were that dead set against it. But most people in the North felt that the most important thing was for the Union to be preserved, for all of the states of the country to remain intact. President Lincoln, in his inaugural address, said that secession would not be permitted, but he also pleaded with the South for compromise. So he sent the message that something will be done, but he was very much looking to finding a diplomatic and peaceful way to create a compromise with the South. During Lincoln's inaugural address, he said, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." So this was Lincoln speaking to the South, saying that they are friends, that they must not be enemies, that although emotions and events of the past may have strained their bonds, he still was looking to keep the country as one whole entity rather than allowing part of it to break off. Now, on April 12th, 1861, so just about 2 months after the final of the original 7 states had seceded, Confederate troops, or Southern troops, attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina, after Lincoln had promised that Union forces would not initiate conflict with the Confederacy, with the South. So after Lincoln had said that there would be no violence from the North, the South were the ones who fired the first shots. Fort Sumter would surrender 2 days later, so it fell into the hands of the South. But the attack led Lincoln to call for 75,000 troops to fight for the Union, and it became very clear that war was going to begin. In the wake of the attack on Fort Sumter, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas also voted to secede and join the Confederate States of America, and the Civil War had officially begun. So that actually brings us to the end of video number 2 in our 6-part series on the American Civil War, and I will leave you with the opportunity to review this video's guiding question one more time. I will be back soon with part 3 of this series, and until then, this has been Professor Blazek, and I will see you next time.